their budgets have been affected by the pandemic. And we need to see this pandemic as potentially an opportunity as well as a threat. We really need to take a lead in the global green recovery, and also to move to mitigate much more slow motion catastrophes. So the climate change and the loss of biodiversity. We really need to think about how we're going to recover from this pandemic in a green way. And particularly playing to what she just told us, we need to use research and innovation to promote regional development and opportunity for diverse sections of communities. Now, our science and technology capability is world-class, and it should be used to help create jobs, improve people's lives, and national resilience. And I think some of the EU regional funding schemes that have then played to local funding and other institutions have been very successful in this regard, and we should really be thinking about this kind of funding in the future. So I know we're short of time. I look forward to hearing more from my colleagues from the other academies about their work and the opportunity to hear from you as well.
Thank you very much. Two reminders, if you want to ask questions, please do through the Q&A function. Please, if you can, say who you are and where you're from. Also, if you need subtitles, please do click on the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our next speaker is Sean Fitzgerald, who is Royal Academy of Engineering Visiting Professor in Sustainable Buildings at the University of Cambridge and member of what us journalists refer to as the shadowy SAGE committee, in this case actually the SAGE Environmental Working Group. You may wonder why he is needed in the pandemic, why sustainable buildings are particularly a need for defeating a pandemic. Well, his extensive background in ventilation, particularly in understanding and developing natural ventilation solutions for buildings, which shows just how broad the expertise is, because of course ventilation is now absolutely crucial. He is a fellow of Girton College, Cambridge, and he was also worked as co-founder and chief executive officer at Breathing Buildings, a company that developed from his extensive research into natural ventilation. He was appointed director of the Royal Institution of Great Britain in 2018, and he has also undertaken a number of business and development roles in the private sector.
Great, thank you, Tom. Tom, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you hear me? Perfect, okay. Well, it's very lovely to be with you all. So I'm here representing the Royal Academy of Engineering. I'm also a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering. And the role of engineering in this pandemic is absolutely critical. It's to work alongside the other academies. And the reason I'm sort of with you today is that, as Tom said, I'm on the SAGE Environmental Working Group. And the particular piece that I bring to the table is about the understanding of ventilation. And as Linda said, that there are various transmission mechanisms at play regarding this horrible pandemic. And there are droplets, there are aerosols, and of course contact transmission. And the role of aerosols actually early on in the pandemic was really not fully understood, perhaps one might even argue not fully recognized by certain authorities, but now it is recognized as potentially a significant factor. And as we go into winter, it's going to be a little bit more challenging, because providing a quote well-ventilated environment has been pretty trivial in the warmer weather. We've been able to spend a lot of time outside, and therefore dispersion of aerosols, nature's done it for us, thank you very much, by us spending time outside. So the mantra that we have heard very recently, that if you think about the government's new message, so hands, face, space, there's a huge amount captured in there about thinking about the ways that you can intervene on the various transmission mechanisms that are responsible for droplet, aerosol and contact. However, there is one that Tom has sort of referred to, which is ventilation in buildings. So I would love to add a fourth, and it's open a window. I mean, it captures lots of sentiments really, but we just haven't needed to think about it in the summer, because you open a window to keep comfortable in terms of temperature. Now, as we move into winter, it's not about necessarily keeping comfortable with regard to temperature. It's trying to keep us sufficiently safe so that we actually get that dispersal of aerosols. So I'm going to leave it there because I know that we're short of time, but I'm going to be very happy to answer questions regarding the engineering mechanisms, mitigation measures, whether it's distancing, how we organize buildings. All of that has been sort of discussed at length by the Environmental Modelling Group. I look forward very much to continuing to work with people from our fellow academies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A reminder, do get those questions in. We have a couple, but if we don't have more, you might be left with my questions. Our next speaker, though, to give you time to think of those questions, is Dayman Johnson, whose coronavirus connection does not need to be explained. She is Professor of Infectious Disease Epidemiology at University College London, although the infectious diseases she specialised in are a bit different. After training in medicine at Cambridge and Newcastle University, she specialised in epidemiology and public health, but focused on research into prevention of HIV and sexually transmitted infections, as well as other infections such as influenza, Ebola, and antimicrobial resistance. I would love to chat to her at some point about, we heard early on in the lockdown that this might be a once in the generation opportunity to get rid of various sexually transmitted diseases because no one was meeting. I think it'd be fascinating to see what's happened to STDs during lockdown, although obviously not if Professor Neil Ferguson has anything to do with it. But she was the principal investigator on the 3 decennial national surveys of sexual attitudes and lifestyle, the revolutionary NATSAL survey. And she is investigator on the UK iSense programme studying point-of-care diagnostics and digital pathways for infectious disease detection. She also co-founded UCL's Institute for Global Health and has advised many national and international science organisations. She chaired the UK Academy of Medical Sciences Working Group on Improving the Health of the Public by 2040, and is the former governor of the Wellcome Trust. She is currently Vice President International of the Academy of Medical Sciences.
Many thanks, Tom, and it's great to be here, so thank you for the invitation. I should mention that in context of the pandemic, I have been involved in the Royal Society's DEL group, so we have been producing reports on a number of topics, which includes face coverings, the test and trace programme, and a very important topic of hospital-acquired infection and infection acquired in social care. I was also involved in a report produced by the Academy of Medical Sciences called Preparing for a Challenging Winter, which regrettably, many of the things that we were concerned about, including transmission, increased transmission, as you've heard today, are very regrettably coming upon us rather faster than even we might have been concerned about in our worst case scenarios. And so we produced that report in July called Preparing for a Challenging Winter, and it considered some of the major challenges that we might face in the winter because of, as you've just heard from Sean, issues around people moving indoors, the greater mixing and greater number of contacts that people have, which would be the sort of environment in which not only transmission of general respiratory viruses like cold and flu might transmit more, but in addition, it was a very good environment for COVID to thrive, regrettably. And we made a number of recommendations around what should be done over the summer to prepare for a challenging winter, to make sure we had everything in place to try and mitigate the worst effects. And just very briefly, those 4 recommendations were first the recommendation to look at methods for minimizing transmission in the community, and particularly having broad public education campaigns and information campaigns, which should be tailored to individuals and particular communities. And it's very striking how variable the transmission rates, as you know, are around the country and in different communities, and how much they've been particularly bad in disadvantaged communities, something that's already been referred to. We also said that they need to be really prepared to reorganise health and social care staff to ensure the kind of separation of COVID and non-COVID cares to prevent cross-infection, to make sure we could work off the backlog of cases that needed to be looked after. As you heard today from the CMO, we need to be able to have the NHS resilient to look after those with COVID and those without COVID, and there are a large number of people awaiting for both routine surgery, but nevertheless for serious conditions, alongside detection, for example, of serious conditions and treatment of cancers. That we needed to have a really good supply of PPE, but also really resilient infection control in hospitals, system-wide control of infection measures to prevent transmission in hospitals, care settings, and indeed in primary care. And we also pointed out that in winter, there would be many more people with symptoms, as we have seen, and that this would put a lot of pressure on the test, trace and isolate program, which would therefore need to be ramped up in size and capacity, as well as being able to deal with capacity locally. We also recommended that we needed to have real-time population surveillance. And I think you'll have seen today, those of you who saw the briefing from Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, how much more we understand about this epidemic now, and we are able to track what's going on, but nevertheless, the very serious concerns about the rise in infection and the importance of acting now. But that is based on having a resilient public health and a public health system. And then lastly, we talked about guarding against the worst effects of flu and the incredible importance of having a really robust flu vaccination program that reached a high proportion of those at risk, including health and social care workers, who are so important for us to keep the health service functional and able to cope over the winter. So Linda's talked about opportunities. And clearly, we now actually are facing a critical moment in the epidemic. We've heard that today. And this is going to be a really difficult balancing act about how to reduce transmission, how to engage the public in what needs to be done to drive down transmission, while at the same time enabling people to get on their lives, enabling the health service to function. And a lot of that will involve the trust of the public in science and in the advice that they receive. But there is another opportunity, and this is in my own field, of moving forward and building a resilient public health system. There has been some disinvestment in that area, and we've seen now the restructuring of public health, and we are awaiting the longer term plans for that. But whatever the plans are, I think it is incredibly important that in that investing in a resilient public health system to be able to cope with shocks like this, but also to deal with critical issues like social inequalities in health, we need a system which has an element of independence to provide the kind of independent scientific advice we've been hearing over the last months, that is research-led and has a strong research component, because you will understand, and I'm sure seen, how important our ability to produce timely, agile research responses and to be honest about what we do and don't know in these situations is extraordinarily important. And any future public health system needs to be closely integrated with not just the national function, but also the kind of local functions that we're seeing around the country with the directors of public health, and to be integrated also into the NHS, so that we ensure that the NHS also has a very important prevention function alongside a treatment function which is aligned with the goals of the public health system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before we go to questions, and I'll just say, do send them in. We've had a few more, but please do try to put your name on them as well. We go to our last speaker, who is Melinda Mills, and Director of the Leverhulme Centre for Demographic Science. She straddles the difficult area of hard science and social and behavioural science. She's a member of the SAGE subcommittee on ethnicity, the ESRC UPCRI COVID Social Science Advisory Group, and the Royal Society's SETC committee, and was lead author of, if you saw the recent report on the use of face coverings for the general public. During the course of this pandemic, she's published on demographic, behavioural and geographical aspects of COVID-19, including age differences in deaths, effective social networks and bubbles, and international comparative responses to COVID in Africa, as well as geographical differences in England and Wales. She is a director of the social business enterprise DNA for Science, and serves on the executive committee of UPCRI ESRC and the supervisory board of the Dutch National Science Council. Thank you very much, Melinda.
Thank you very much. So yeah, so I arrived here 6 years ago as a Dutch EU worker. I now have settled status, but I'm a Canadian as well, so I can vote. And thank you for the introduction. I think what COVID has really shown is how the importance that Linda was talking about international collaboration. My research is largely supported by the European Research Council to be interdisciplinary and high risk. And I think, you know, it allowed us to enter into this area and be prepared to be able to look at questions. And, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about the life sciences and the medical sciences, and these have been really key. And I represent the British Academy, which looks at social behavioral sciences and humanities, such as history and learning from the past. I was the author as well on the, as Tom mentioned, on face coverings and behavioral approaches. And I'd just like to reflect a little bit on what history and behavior can offer us as well. I'm currently working on a report that should be released soon that talks about misinformation and conspiracy theories, for example, in relation to vaccinations for Set C from the Royal Society as well. So, you know, what has the pandemic really taught us? You know, a lot of the things that Chi was talking about are actually social and behavioral science questions about inequalities, about, you know, geographical concentration of COVID and inequalities. So some of our work went down to the neighborhood level. We already saw in March, and we could predict there'd be hotspots because population density, intergenerational households, things related to social deprivation, all of these different aspects were already quite clear. Another thing we learned from the historical research was that, you know, there's certain things that you should do when there's a pandemic outbreak. So a lot of the Eastern Asian countries, you know, had the Pandemic 101 manual that they pulled out, and they instituted face coverings and many of these things before. So understanding history and not having it repeat itself is important. And think about Japan, they've had about 1,500 deaths in a population of 126 million. So they acted quickly because they had experience with SARS. So I guess the last thing I'd like to say, and, you know, to give you an idea about the value of, you know, these social behavioral factors as well too, think about the vaccine. So we just saw in, you know, at 11 o'clock at the press conference that, you know, people are waiting for this vaccine to be released. What if it's released and no one takes it? So we know from H1N1 that they had about a 50% lower uptake of people actually taking the vaccine once it was released. And a recent survey actually in the UK said that about 40% of people were uncertain if they would take the vaccine. And about 10% were staunchly saying that they won't take it because you know, they don't trust it, it's been developed too fast, and they've read other information about it. So, you know, what we're focusing on, this was the same for the face coverings, and it's repeating itself when we're looking at misinformation in relation to vaccines. So there's a few things. Annalise Dodds was actually already talking about it this morning, about trust. So people have to have confidence. They have to have trust in the government. They have to have trust in the vaccine and the safety of it. And that trust is helped with transparency. It's really important. The other thing I think that's really important is people become complacent as well too, and they become fatigued, and we have to understand ways to help people deal with this. We've had a lot of problems with domestic violence, with people, mental health issues, and this has to be seen as quite important. And there's also a lot of inequalities, so things have to be convenient for people as well too. You know, and as Chi was also saying, you know, it's this pandemic has exposed the inequalities in our society. People, you know, have to use, there's certain people that have to use public transport. They can't stay at home. You know, they're having all of these issues financially on how to deal with this, and we really have to think about the lived experiences. And finally, just sort of understanding, you know, people's backgrounds, the languages that they speak, speaking to them in a culturally effective way is really important. So those are some of my points that I'd like to raise.
Thank you very much, everyone. So we still have space for questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to direct some of the questions directly to panelists who I think would be most appropriate to answer them. If others want to jump in, they can send me a message on our sort of secret WhatsApp that we've been using to communicate, and I'm happy to take them. And some of the questions I will direct to everyone if I think that's most appropriate. The first question, I think, given her experience during the pandemic, probably has to go to Melinda. We have a question. On Twitter recently, there was a debate around comments made by Noel Gallagher, the songwriter, who declared on a podcast that he hasn't been wearing a mask and won't wear one because it's an infringement on his liberty. If I get the virus, he said, it's not on me, it's on me, not anybody else. So Melinda, what would you say to Noel Gallagher?
What would I say to Noel Gallagher? Well, you know, beyond liking his music, this is actually a real problem, and it's talking about, you know, the complacency that some people have, and that people feel that they're not actually at risk. And we actually see that there's certain groups such as men that actually, engage in less stringent adherence to public health messages and interventions. But I think, what we found in this Royal Society British Academy report about face coverings is actually, you just have to understand it isn't all about you, Noel. You can, it does offer you some protection. So we did a meta-analysis and you could see from the existing studies, it doesn't protect you entirely. But if you wear, a well-constructed multi-layer mask, it fits properly, you're actually protecting everyone else around you. So it's actually quite asocial, to engage in this kind of behavior and not wear a mask. So, I would say to Noel, just think about people, around you. It isn't all about you. It's about us. And that's about all of these interventions. It's about everybody around you.
And I think Sean would like to make a comment on exactly the same subject. So we haven't quite left berating Noel Gallagher yet. I'm sure he's quaking. Sean, what have you got to say?
Oh, I'm not in the game of trying to berate anybody, Tom. But what I would like to encourage us is to think of actually others. So I think there's a whole philosophy here, which I think was apparent early on in the pandemic, when we were rallying for others and doing our bit. And actually, it's not just to do with face coverings, it's everything. For example, limiting your social interactions. We heard that at 11 o'clock. And if we can all work hard on thinking about the transmission mechanisms, and it means being selfless. All right, what can we do to help suppress the spread of this virus? And it really means don't think about yourself, but doing it for the sake of others. And that gets you a long way in terms of a whole set of behavior changes, which then allow somebody, frankly, sorting out face coverings. How good are you washing your hands? All right, am I doing it for me? Well, my sons aren't doing it for themselves, because they're, frankly, if they get it, they're going to be at fairly low risk. They're doing it for the older folk like myself. So thinking of others.
So the next question, I've just seen that Chi has to leave at 2, so I was going to save this question, but I'd very much like all the panelists to have an answer to this. And I think it'd be most sensible if we start with Chi. Thank you very much for your patience. So the question comes from an anonymous viewer, is a very simple one and an extremely pertinent one. What have we learned that could help us prepare for future pandemics?
That is a fantastic question. Can you hear me, firstly? We've learnt the importance of Zoom audio. So I think one of the things which struck me was, and I think we've discussed it briefly, was how countries that had had experience of SARS had, if you like, a box, almost like a out-of-the-box sort of series of measures that we took over time, from lockdown to face coverings. And one of the things that confused me was why and we talked about the international scientific community, why we weren't able to learn quickly enough from the experience of other countries who were facing coronavirus and had faced SARS. And I think one of the things that we have learned is not to believe perhaps so much in the British exceptionalism, but to take the experience of other countries and also to respond and react more quickly. I also think it's really important to say, and Sean, I am still trying to find out exactly what information about the movement of the virus in closed and open conditions. I've seen some unpeer-reviewed studies, but they haven't been officially approved by a learned institute. And it's becoming, as you say, increasingly important as we go into the autumn and the winter. So I think we've also learned, which to be fair, some of us knew, the importance of effective communication and messaging. And just on the previous question, whilst I don't particularly care about Noel Gallagher, though he has a significant platform which he should use to better account, I do care hugely about my constituents. And in my local Granger market the other day, I had so many constituents talking to me about the disinformation, the conspiracy theories on their Facebook and other social media sites and how that was influencing what many of them, how they would respond to requests about face coverings and lockdown. And I think you have to recognize that, and this is a challenge, that Facebook and the other social media are proliferating and promoting disinformation, whereas the knowledge and insight of the fantastic people and institutions that we have recommended on this rate, and I will include the Times in that, Tom, they are not being promoted onto people's like face time, onto people's views. And so we need a better preparedness for that, because whilst everyone has a right to, including Noel Gallagher, to believe what they choose to believe, this is something where we are truly all each other's neighbours, and we cannot all be healthy. We cannot one of us be healthy unless all of us are healthy, and that actually applies globally as well as within the UK. So we need to have I think we need to have a better way, and this comes to the general regulation of social media as well. We need to have a better way of dealing with misinformation in these circumstances.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Linda, do you have something you'd like to add on this topic?
Just a few things. I there were some very human reasons for the lack of resilience when the pandemic first hit, because we were rather flat-footed and slow to get moving. I think combination, as Hugh said, we didn't have the experience of SARS and MERS and the other really dangerous respiratory infections. So I think there was almost a collective disbelief that this was happening, but also political short-termism, optimism bias, the perceived financial inefficiency of stockpiles, I think, was really important. We needed the equipment ready to go, as many other countries had, and we just didn't do that. And we really need, I think, to build in institutional mitigations to counter them. So we need to, it's been done for the banks, it needs to be done for pandemics and for the other risks that we're facing. And these risks need to go on the National Risk Register, and we need preparation for them. I mean, this one was already very high on the risk register, actually. We just didn't prepare for it. So I think there are many mechanisms there. And I think also the ones that I've already mentioned for investing in science and establishing mechanisms by which governments can get quick advice about how to deal with a crisis, including these very slow motion crises that have been pushed to one side because of the pandemic, but loss of biodiversity and climate change, they haven't gone away.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to go to your views on this, Anne, as well. But there's another question that might play to your expertise, if you could chat to that as well. Kendrick Fowler in the Blackpool Labour Party has said, a lot of young people who have survived coronavirus have still been left with long-term health problems. Would a vaccine also cure these problems? If you're able to chat about that and also about your views on what we might have learned.
So just on the vaccine front, I think it's difficult to comment on exactly what impact a vaccine would have, but generally vaccines work by one of two mechanisms, either by actually preventing transmission or acquiring the virus, or else kind of changing the response that you might get if you were to get infected. So they won't all block transmission, but they may ameliorate the sort of response that you get. So although you couldn't say that the vaccine might cure, in that sense, long-term impacts, it might reduce the severity of them, although again, there is likely to be sort of variability between individuals. But I think there are a number of vaccines, as you know, in many being studied around the world, and they all have slightly different designs and may work by slightly different mechanisms. So I think it's there's some way before us being able to answer exactly what impact they might have on people who have been vaccinated but still become infected, and what the long-term impacts were. But generally speaking, they might ameliorate them. And just on long-term plan on the future, I mean, there have been many exercises thinking about future pandemics, but they've been largely focused on flu planning. And of course, that's always the problem. We're always in a sense planning on the basis of the last pandemic and not the current one and the last virus. So this is a new virus with a very different characteristics, for example, than flu in its clinical outcomes. So that is one thing, is really having a resilient early warning system that is linked internationally. I actually absolutely agree about the importance of international links, and that we also have a robust early warning system What is now emerging around the world is that in many places, these viruses or early transmission probably occurred in Europe rather earlier than we originally thought. And we already had, by the time we were locking down, there had been many transmissions, and we hadn't really understood the extent of the epidemic. So having that kind of resilient early warning system for surveillance is hugely important. I would add to that the comment that I made earlier, that the response, a lot of our response has been, as Melinda said, we've been entirely reliant on behaviour change actually as a mechanism for reducing transmission. So we're very dependent on the public, our ability to communicate and build trust with the public. So again, public communication, very important. But remember also that a lot of the response to this epidemic was in the National Health Service, which is often mainly concerned with treatment. And yet what they were doing is they had a huge role in the public health response as well. Notably, and this is another thing that we missed really, was the extent of transmission that occurred in hospitals and actually between hospitals and care homes, which we didn't understand because we didn't have testing in place or understand the extent of asymptomatic transmission. And I think now it's really important that we continue to be very mindful and watchful about transmission again occurring in hospitals or between hospitals and care homes, and really having a robust NHS in terms of infection control. We got on top of that for MRSA, but we're now dealing with the virus with very different transmission characteristics. So this prevention function and resilience of the NHS goes well beyond just treating patients, but also the role they have in prevention. And that does need to be linked up with the public health agencies and with the kind of data that Linda talked about earlier, so we can understand better what's going on.
Great. And I'm wondering, this is a question to all panelists, maybe starting with Melinda. Today's been quite a depressing day if you've been following the coronavirus news. Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance have put up some really quite stark graphs and quite a stark assessment of where the country is as we go into winter. Are there any positives we can take from the first 6 months of the pandemic and our response to it? And yeah, if we start with Melinda on that.
Well, I think some positives that we can take is there was a lot of skepticism that the public wouldn't adhere to many of the interventions, such as hand hygiene, social distancing, wearing face coverings. And actually the public has been very compliant, and there have been few sort of cases where there's been problems. So I think in that sense, communication has been problematic. That was already mentioned by Anne and Linda and others, but actually we can take some things away that, there's that, but also, just revealing the inequalities, the deep inequalities that have been revealed from this pandemic means that we have to reboot a lot of things. Transportation, we're rethinking right now. We're rethinking schools and education, how we work and how we live and how we commute back and forth. So it actually offers an opportunity to level up. So I think, that's just one sort of thought of how it's sort of made us pause and rethink.
Sean, how about you from maybe more of an engineering perspective?
So as you mentioned in the introduction, so I'm a visiting professor at Cambridge on sustainable buildings, but I'm also the acting director for the Centre for Climate Repair, which is part of Cambridge Zero. And it's all about trying to think about actually climate change and tackling climate change. And as Linda said in the opening remarks, this is a longer term, but my goodness me, potentially even bigger issue for society. And the one positive that I have from this is that it's 12 months ago, the kind of money that government has been talking about and using, or that governments have been using to address COVID-19, if I'd used that kind of sum in terms of these are the sorts of sums that we need to start thinking about to address and invest in tackling climate change, I would have been laughed off the stage. Well, we've got new normals now. So the quantum being talked about is something that we can engage in a conversation with, and also, I'm not an economist, but the weirdest thing is that you borrowed a huge amount of money. One of the ways of getting out of this is to borrow even more and be very, very smart about where you invest it. So actually, this does potentially provide us with a significant opportunity to address arguably the largest issue facing humankind at the moment, which is actually for the next 100 years and getting it sorted out, which is changing society, which means also getting things like, and the license to do this is getting equity resolved and imbalancing, getting rid of the imbalances in society, but all about moving towards a new normal in terms of how we create a new society, which is more sustainable. So that's the one positive I've got, is that I think we're more able to have those conversations and to get money flowing for certainly experimental research and then deployment.
Anne, do you have any positives?
So I absolutely agree with what Sean said, and I think there's a huge opportunity to now invest in carbon reduction and the new technologies that could drive that, and also the way we live in doing that. I mean, in terms of travel and the way we work, and even what we're doing now. For the health service, we've seen a revolution in terms of use of telemedicine and digital medicine. These are technologies we've been talking about. I was on the Topple review. We talked about the opportunities for digital medicine, and much of the traveling and moving around of people could be done much more conveniently if they were able to consult online or on telephone, and the NHS couldn't sort that. And yet we've driven an absolute transformation in the way we deliver healthcare. So I think there are some really interesting technological advances. And I hope we will also think very much about how we operate as a society along many of the dimensions that others have mentioned. And it was very striking today when Patrick was talking about how you prevent this transmission. And it really does involve the sort of discussion we've had earlier of people understanding that any effort they make, the collective sum of that, is what will make a difference, because we are all in the business of sort of driving chains of transmission potentially. And that drives a kind of different sort of social discussion, and one which is also about driving forward how we protect the more vulnerable in our society, and how much this pandemic, as many others have, laid bare all those inequalities. So maybe there will be a different conversation, but that's the optimist in me. I don't know.
Linda, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I think one of the things I find tremendously heartening is the extraordinary agility of the science community. It was really striking the way many labs altered what they were doing to address the pandemic in different ways, you know, from giving up equipment to the diagnosis service, to participating in it, to redirecting their own research. Collaborations sprang up, activities like the ones orchestrated by the Royal Society came into being almost overnight, and I think have spawned long-term changes in the way that people are going to work. I think people have realized how quickly you can do things if the pressure's on. I think also I've been very heartened by the way that the scientists have pressed for openness. I think it's to get public trust, you have to be honest and open about what you're doing. And I think the way the scientists have pressed to have the proceedings at SAGE, the minutes of the SAGE meetings published and put in the open domain, so people can look for themselves at what the current state of the information is and reach their own conclusions. I think that kind of trust and dialogue backwards and forwards between experts and the general public is really extremely important. I've also been extraordinarily struck by the kindness of people, the way that people rallied during the pandemic to look after each other. The one downside that I would of course focus on because of my own research speciality is the position of old people in the community at the moment. There are plenty of healthy elders, and as far as this virus is concerned, you know, old starts quite young. And at the moment, they're very much not participating in society because of the threat from the virus. They're excluded, and it's not the worst problem we're facing, but it is a big one. And I think we need to understand a lot more about what's making old people vulnerable to this virus and how we can fix that.
Thank you very much indeed. We're coming towards the end of our session. And I'm wondering if, as we close, it's lovely to end on a positive note. Would each of you have thoughts on what you think science has done well and what has perhaps been done slightly worse in this pandemic? And I'm going to pick on Melinda first.
What have we done well? Well, I think echoing some of the things that Linda said already, that, we've pushed, very hard. I think some of the things that we've done less well is working together in an interdisciplinary way. So I think, there's been some surprises about sort of the behavioral factors, of course I would say that, or the historical factors, or what we could have learned actually from history or internationally from other countries. I think that's been a real blind spot. But given the time, I'll turn to the next person.
Great. Sean, what about your thoughts?
So I think the scientists, I think, have worked ridiculously well together in terms of getting up to speed. I've been involved in the RAMP group as well, just seeing the collaboration and the earnest work that they have done together. The one area that I would cite as that has been sort of a challenge for us all is the way that data just hasn't been as forthcoming or just not as available. And I think this is an infrastructure kind of thing, or maybe it's policy, Tom. But we can only do so much with the data that we currently have, and we're desperate to try and get more data, certainly as outbreaks, for example, occur, and having that come to us available, make that available in a timely fashion so we can try and learn more quickly. So I think that possibly is, if I could look for a lesson learned that we can try and improve upon for the scientists, we can do a lot more with better data, and the data scientists in particular would be able to add, I would argue, probably a lot more value.
Great. What about you, Anne?
I would say that, again, it's been the amazing way people have worked together and the science has moved on. But I don't think we've been honest enough about uncertainty. And very early on, people with very little information were making quite definite statements about routes of transmission, for example, without actually being prepared to say, we don't really know yet. And these are the things we've got to understand, similarly with the immunology. And the second one is the classic failure of science, that we are so hopeful for it that we can somehow produce a silver bullet in next to no time, in this case a vaccine. And now I think people are realizing not only the time frame of that, but also the limitations of delivering vaccines, how effective they'll be and all that. And so in the end, any means of suppressing this pandemic and coping with it does involve this sort of cross-disciplinary working Melinda's talked about. And that we've had to rely very heavily on exactly the same interventions. If you read the history of the flu pandemic in 1918, we're relying on very similar interventions and having very similar debates. And I'm very much enjoying reading a book on that topic and realizing how little we learn from the past. So we must also learn from the past. But I also recognize that science has advanced enormously, and we really understand a lot more about the virus and the way it's transmitted and its form and structure than we would have been able to do 100 years ago. I hope that in time will deliver the benefits we're all hoping for in terms of vaccines and treatments.
And finally, I think, Linda, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree with Sean about data. And I do think part of the failure there is a very human one, which is that quite often people who've gathered data or have control of data tend to sit on it. And I think we need to stop them doing that. I think that is a scientific weakness, I'm afraid. And I think we also need to, there's another gap. We need to be more organised about the way in which we get science advice to government, so that if there is an emergency, we have a set of conduits through which they can immediately contact the people they need to contact. We need a national register. And at the moment, we don't have that kind of organisation.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of the speakers, and apologies to the people whose questions we couldn't quite get to. I really appreciate this opportunity to chair this panel. I've been a journalist for 15 years and I've been waiting for my first invite to a party conference, and I've finally got one, and I'm not drinking warm white wine and preparing to hit the dance floor with some Labour backbenchers, hopefully next year. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.